I stood in front of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA board meeting, my hands trembling as I held a folder containing 2 years' worth of documentation about soil inconsistencies in my backyard, and I knew they were about to think I was completely insane. Mr. Patterson, you've requested emergency session time, said Linda Carmichael, the HOA president, her perfectly styled blonde hair not moving an inch as she looked down at me from the board table. She was the epitome of a suburban control enthusiast, always wearing her pastel cardigans and pearl necklaces like armor. This better be important. We have actual violations to discuss. I cleared my throat, glancing around the community center meeting room in Gilbert, Arizona. 5 board members sat before me, their faces ranging from mildly annoyed to completely disinterested. Besides Linda, there was Treasurer Marcus Webb, Secretary Patricia Hoffman, and members David Chen and Barbara Reynolds. About 15 other homeowners sat in the audience, probably expecting another thrilling discussion about fence heights. I know this sounds unusual, I began, opening my folder. But for the past 2 years, I've been monitoring ground settlement patterns in my yard at 4782 Seguero Vista Drive. I've documented over 300 separate measurements, soil samples, and photographic evidence of consistent subsidence occurring in a very specific pattern. Linda's expression shifted from annoyed to concerned, but not in the way I hoped. Mr. Patterson, are you saying you've been digging holes in your yard? Because that requires Architectural Review Committee approval for any landscaping changes. No, I haven't been digging, that's the point. The ground is sinking on its own. Approximately 2 inches per year in a rectangular pattern roughly 20 feet by 30 feet. I've been using surveying equipment to track it. Barbara Reynolds leaned forward, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Surveying equipment in your backyard. That seems a bit excessive, doesn't it? I felt my face flush. This was exactly what I was afraid of. I know it sounds obsessive, that's why I'm here. I need to confess that I've become somewhat fixated on this issue, but I have a good reason. I think something is buried under my property, and I think it might affect the entire neighborhood. The room went silent. A few homeowners in the audience whispered to each other. Linda exchanged glances with the other board members. What do you think is buried there? Marcus Webb asked, his tone suggesting he already regretted the question. I don't know exactly, but the settlement pattern is too uniform to be natural. It's not a sinkhole. It's not typical soil compression. Something man-made is down there and it's deteriorating or collapsing. Patricia Hoffman, who had been typing notes on her laptop, stopped and looked up. Have you contacted the city or a geological survey company? I did. 3 months ago, the city said since it's on private property and not causing immediate structural damage to my house, it's not their concern. The geological company wanted $15,000 for a preliminary investigation. My home insurance won't cover it because there's no active damage claim. Linda tapped her pen against her notepad, a habit I had noticed in previous meetings. Mr. Patterson, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, but I'm not sure what you expect the HOA to do about soil conditions on your private property. That's outside our purview. I pulled out a map I had created, walking up to pin it on the presentation board. That's what I thought too, until last week. I started checking the county records and historical property surveys. This entire development, Meadowbrook Hills, was built in 2019 on land that was previously owned by Gilbert Municipal Services. Before that, from 1968 to 2015, this area was designated as municipal storage and maintenance yards. David Chen sat up straighter. Municipal storage, what does that mean? It means the city stored equipment, vehicles, and materials here, possibly for decades. But here's what's interesting. I found a work order from 1994 for the removal and disposal of underground storage tanks from this location. 6 tanks, each with a capacity of 10,000 gallons, supposedly containing diesel, fuel, and motor oil for city vehicles. The room's energy changed immediately. Several homeowners stood up to see my map better. Linda's expression had gone from dismissive to alarmed. "Are you suggesting there are still fuel tanks under your property?" she asked, her voice tight. "I'm suggesting that the settlement pattern matches exactly where those tanks would have been based on the old site diagrams. I'm suggesting that maybe they weren't all properly removed. And I'm suggesting that if one or more of those tanks is still down there, leaking or corroding, we might have a serious environmental contamination issue affecting everyone in this neighborhood." Barbara Reynolds pulled out her phone. "This is a matter for environmental authorities. We need to contact the EPA and the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality immediately." "I already tried," I said. "They need evidence of actual contamination before they'll investigate. Soil settlement alone isn't enough." They suggested I hire a private environmental consultant, which again costs thousands of dollars I don't have. Linda stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting is temporarily suspended. Board members' emergency session in the back office. Now." The 5 board members filed into the small office behind the meeting room. I stood there awkwardly as the other homeowners erupted into concerned chatter. My neighbor from 3 houses down, Greg Martinson, approached me. "Is this for real, Michael? You really think there's old fuel tanks under your yard?" "I think it's possible. The evidence points to something being there." "Jesus. My kids play in that yard sometimes when they visit your kids." My stomach dropped. I had been so focused on the mystery of what was underground that I hadn't fully processed the potential danger. "Greg, I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I just didn't want to cause panic without proof." "Without proof? You've been measuring this for 2 years." An elderly woman I recognized as Helen Morrison from the end of the street joined us. "My husband worked for Gilbert City Services back in the 80s. He mentioned once that they had problems with some old storage tanks out in the eastern yards. Said it was a mess when they tried to decommission them." "Do you remember any details?" I asked eagerly. "Not really. He passed away in 2021, but I remember him saying something about budget cuts and corners being cut. This was during that whole economic recession in the early 90s. Before I could ask more questions, Linda emerged from the office, her face pale. The other board members followed her back to the table. She picked up the gavel and tapped it twice. "This meeting is back in session. After discussion, the board has decided this is a matter of community safety and potentially affects property values for all homeowners in Meadowbrook Hills. Mr. Patterson, we're going to authorize an emergency expenditure from the HOA Reserve Fund to hire an environmental consulting firm to investigate your property. However, you'll need to sign a liability waiver and access agreement." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Absolutely. Thank you. I know this seemed crazy, but I really think something is wrong." Marcus Webb looked at his laptop screen. "I'm looking at our reserve fund now. We have approximately $80,000. A proper environmental investigation could cost anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 depending on what they find. This is a significant expense. If there's contamination, wouldn't the city be liable?" someone from the audience asked. "Potentially," Linda said. "But first we need to establish if there's actually anything there. Patricia, can you start contacting environmental firms tomorrow morning?" Patricia nodded, already typing notes. "I'll get quotes from at least 3 companies. We should have someone out here within a week." The meeting continued for another hour, with Linda fielding increasingly worried questions from homeowners. Were their properties at risk? Should they get their water tested? What about property values if this became public knowledge? I answered what I could, showing my documentation to anyone who wanted to see it. By the time the meeting ended at nearly 10 p.m., I was exhausted but vindicated. They had listened. They were taking action. As I packed up my materials, Linda approached me. Up close, I could see the worry lines around her eyes that her makeup didn't quite hide. "Michael, I need you to understand something. If your theory is wrong and we spend $40,000 of community money on this, there will be consequences. Some homeowners will want you to be held financially responsible. I understand, but I'm not wrong. I've triple-checked everything. I hope you're right, because if you're not, you might want to start looking for a new neighborhood to live in. She walked away before I could respond. I drove home through the dark streets of Meadowbrook Hills, looking at the identical stucco houses with their xeriscaped front yards and HOA-approved paint colors. Somewhere under these streets, under these properties, there might be ticking time bombs of environmental disaster. My wife Jennifer was still awake when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop. "How did it go?" she asked, looking up at me with cautious optimism. "They're going to investigate. They're using HOA funds to hire an environmental company." She let out a breath. "Thank God." "I was worried they'd just dismiss you as some crazy person." Linda basically threatened me, said if I'm wrong, there will be consequences. Jennifer closed her laptop. "You're not wrong. I've seen the data. I've watched you measure that yard every week for 2 years. Something is definitely happening." I sat down across from her, rubbing my eyes. What if we're wrong about what's causing it? What if it is just weird soil compression and I just convinced the HOA to waste $50,000? Then we deal with it. "But Michael, you've been losing sleep over this for months. At least now you'll get answers." Our daughter Emma, who was supposed to be asleep, appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was 12, with Jennifer's dark hair and my stubborn personality. "Dad, are we going to have to move?" she asked quietly. "No, honey. Why would you think that? I heard you and Mom talking last week about contamination and property values and stuff." Jennifer got up and hugged Emma. "Everything is going to be fine. Your dad is just being thorough and making sure our house is safe." "Is it not safe now?" I chose my words carefully. "There's no evidence of any immediate danger. This is just a precaution. We're being responsible homeowners." Emma didn't look convinced, but she let Jennifer guide her back to bed. I sat alone in the kitchen, looking out the window at my backyard. The outdoor lights illuminated the area where I knew the subsidence was occurring. 2 years of my life spent measuring, documenting, obsessing over a rectangular patch of earth. The next morning, Patricia called me at 8 a.m. I was getting ready for work, trying to function on 4 hours of sleep. "Michael, I've already contacted 3 environmental consulting firms. 2 can't start for at least 3 weeks, but one company, Southwest Environmental Solutions out of Phoenix, can send someone today for an initial assessment. They're expensive, but they're supposedly the best. Today, that's fast. Linda wants this resolved quickly, one way or another. Can you be available at your property around 2 p.m.? I'll take a half day from work. Thank you, Patricia." I called my supervisor at the architecture firm where I worked and explained I had a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. Then I called Jennifer to let her know what was happening. At exactly 2 p.m., a white truck with Southwest Environmental Solutions printed on the side pulled up to my house. 2 people got out, a woman in her 50s wearing cargo pants and a company polo shirt, and a younger man carrying equipment cases. The woman extended her hand as she approached. "Michael Patterson, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Senior Environmental Consultant. This is my associate, Travis Morrison. Patricia Hoffman gave us the basics, but I'd like to hear directly from you what's going on." I walked them to the backyard, grateful that I had taken the time to organize all my documentation. For the next 30 minutes, I explained everything while Dr. Chen took notes and Travis set up various pieces of equipment. "You've been thorough," Dr. Chen said, reviewing my measurement logs. "These settlement patterns are definitely unusual. Travis, let's start with the GPR." "What's GPR?" I asked. "Ground-penetrating radar. It'll give us a subsurface image without having to dig. If there are large man-made objects down there, we'll see them." Travis wheeled a device that looked like a high-tech lawn mower across the area I had identified. He moved in a grid pattern, stopping occasionally to mark spots with small flags. Dr. Chen watched a screen displaying the radar readings, her expression growing increasingly focused. After about 40 minutes, she called Travis over and pointed at something on the screen. They had a quiet conversation I couldn't hear. Finally, she waved me over. "Mr. Patterson, you were right to be concerned. There are definitely large metallic objects buried approximately 15 feet down in this area. Based on the size and shape, they're consistent with underground storage tanks. I'm seeing what appears to be 3 separate tanks." My heart started racing. 3 tanks. The records said 6 were supposed to be removed. Records aren't always accurate, especially from 30 years ago. What concerns me more is this. She pointed at the screen where I could see a dark area surrounding one of the tank shapes. That shadowing could indicate soil contamination. The ground around the tanks has different density than the surrounding soil. So they're leaking, possibly, or they leaked in the past and then sealed. We won't know until we do soil sampling. But given the age of these tanks, if they were installed in the 70s or 80s, they're well past their typical lifespan. Most steel underground storage tanks last 20 to 30 years before they start corroding. Travis had moved to a different part of the yard. "Dr. Chen, you should see this. The readings extend beyond the property line." We walked over to where Travis was pointing. The backyard fence marked my property boundary, but according to the radar, the underground tanks continued onto the neighboring property, which belonged to a family named the Hendersons. "This is going to get complicated," Dr. Chen said. "We're going to need access to at least 2 more properties to map the full extent of whatever is down here, and we need to start soil testing immediately. I'll need to drill some test wells." "How long will all this take?" "The initial testing. We can have preliminary results in 3 days. But a full investigation, especially if we confirm contamination, could take weeks or months. And Mr. Patterson, I need to be honest with you. If we do find significant contamination, this becomes a Superfund issue. The EPA will get involved. Your property could be declared a hazardous site." The word Superfund hit me like a punch. I had heard about Superfund sites, places so contaminated they became federal environmental disasters, property values destroyed, families displaced, years of cleanup. What happens to my family if that happens? That's a legal question I can't answer. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's confirm what we're dealing with. Dr. Chen made some calls, and within 2 hours, a drilling crew arrived with a truck-mounted drilling rig. They set up in 3 locations in my backyard and began drilling narrow test wells. The noise was incredible, and soon neighbors were coming out to see what was happening. Linda Carmichael arrived at 5 p.m., still wearing her work clothes from her job at her real estate office. She looked at the drilling equipment and the growing crowd of concerned neighbors with barely concealed anxiety. "What did they find?" she asked me. "Underground tanks. At least 3 of them, maybe more. They're testing the soil now for contamination. This is a nightmare. I've already had 6 phone calls from homeowners wanting to know what's going on." Dr. Chen walked over, wiping dirt from her hands. "Are you the HOA president? We need to discuss logistics. This investigation is going to require access to multiple properties. We've mapped the tank field and it extends under at least 5 different houses. We'll need permission from all those homeowners to do testing." Linda looked like she might be sick. 5 houses. Which ones? Dr. Chen pulled out a tablet showing a map overlay. She pointed to my house and the 4 surrounding properties. The Hendersons, the Martinsons, the Kowalskis, and a rental property owned by someone named James Fletcher. "I'll need to call an emergency neighborhood meeting," Linda said. "This is beyond anything we've dealt with before." The drilling continued until dark. Dr. Chen's team collected soil samples from various depths, sealing them in labeled containers. Before they left, Dr. Chen pulled me aside. "I'm doing rush analysis on these samples. We should know by Thursday if there's petroleum contamination and at what levels. But Michael, I want you to be prepared. Based on what I saw today and the age of those tanks, I'd say there's a 90% chance we're going to find contamination. What should I do in the meantime? Don't drink well water if you have it." Don't let your kids play directly on the soil in that area. And honestly, you might want to consult with a lawyer. This is going to get complex. After they left, Jennifer and I sat on the back patio, looking at the test well markers now dotting our yard. Emma was at her friend's house, which I was grateful for. I knew there was something down there, I said, but I didn't think it would be this big. What are we going to do if the house is contaminated? We can't afford to move. We put everything we had into this place. I don't know. But Linda mentioned the city might be liable. If they failed to properly remove the tanks, they might have to pay for remediation. Jennifer laughed bitterly. How long do you think that legal battle would take? Years. And in the meantime, we live on top of a toxic waste site. I didn't have an answer for that. The next day, Linda organized an emergency neighborhood meeting at the community center. The room was packed with angry, scared homeowners. Someone had already posted about the situation on the Meadowbrook Hills Facebook group, and rumors were flying. Linda banged the gavel repeatedly to get everyone to quiet down. I know you're all concerned. We're going to have Dr. Sarah Chen from Southwest Environmental Solutions explain what they've found so far. Please hold your questions until the end, Dr. Chen stood up front with her tablet, projecting images onto the screen. She showed the ground-penetrating radar results, the locations of the buried tanks, and the map of affected properties. What we know so far is that there are at least 3, possibly 4, underground storage tanks buried approximately 15 feet below the surface in this area. Based on historical records Mr. Patterson provided, these were likely installed between 1970 and 1985 for municipal vehicle fuel storage. They were supposed to be removed in 1994, but clearly that didn't happen, or at least not completely. How dangerous is this? Someone shouted from the back. That depends on whether the tanks are leaking and what they contained. We've taken soil samples and we're testing for petroleum hydrocarbons, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, commonly known as BTEX compounds. These are typical components of gasoline and diesel fuel. If present in high concentrations, they can pose health risks. A woman I didn't know stood up. I have 3 young children. Should I be evacuating my house? Not based on what we know right now. The tanks are deep enough that immediate surface exposure risk is low. But I wouldn't do any gardening or let children play directly on the soil in the affected areas until we have test results. Greg Martinson raised his hand. What happens to our property values? We just bought our house 2 years ago. If this becomes public knowledge, we're going to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. The room erupted into overlapping conversations. Linda banged the gavel again. Let her finish. Dr. Chen, what's the timeline for results? I'll have preliminary test results by Thursday afternoon. If we confirm contamination, I'm legally required to report it to the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality within 24 hours. At that point, it becomes a matter of public record. So we have until Friday before this destroys everyone's property values, Marcus Webb said grimly. Assuming the results are bad. That's one way to look at it, Dr. Chen said. But I'd encourage you to think about this differently. If there is contamination, it's been there since before any of you moved in. The responsible party is whoever failed to properly remove those tanks, likely the city of Gilbert or the contractor they hired. You're victims in this situation, not responsible parties. Helen Morrison, the elderly woman whose husband had worked for the city, stood up. I might have something helpful. After the HOA meeting, I went through my husband's old papers. He kept work documents in boxes in the garage. I found a memo from 1994 about the tank removal project. It mentions cost overruns and a decision to only remove the tanks that were readily accessible. The other tanks were to be cleaned in place and abandoned. The room went silent. Do you still have that memo? Dr. Chen asked. Yes, I brought copies for the board. Helen walked to the front and distributed papers. Linda read hers, her face getting redder with each line. This is evidence that the city knowingly left tanks in the ground. They didn't even properly decommission them. They just decided it was cheaper to abandon them. That was legal at the time, Dr. Chen said. Environmental regulations in the early 90s weren't as strict as they are now. But it's still evidence of how those tanks ended up there and who's responsible. David Chen raised his hand. So the city could be liable for cleanup costs, potentially. But that's a legal determination, not a scientific one. What I can tell you is that if we confirm contamination, the city will be very interested in this memo because it establishes their knowledge and actions regarding the tanks. The meeting went on for 2 more hours. By the end, Linda had established a special committee to handle the crisis, hired a lawyer who specialized in environmental law to represent the HOA's interests, and authorized up to $100,000 from the reserve fund and a special assessment if needed to cover costs. I left feeling both vindicated and guilty. I had been right, but now over 100 families were caught up in this nightmare. Thursday afternoon, Dr. Chen called me. I was at work, trying to focus on designing a commercial building renovation, but my mind was elsewhere. Michael, we have preliminary results. Can you get the HOA board together? I'd rather present this to everyone at once. That bad, just get them together. I can be at the community center at 6 p.m. I called Linda, who made the calls to other board members. At 6 p.m., we gathered in the same meeting room, this time just the board, me, Jennifer, and a lawyer named Robert Garrison that the HOA had hired. Dr. Chen set up her laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet of test results. I'm going to be direct. We found significant petroleum contamination in the soil surrounding the underground tanks. Concentrations of benzene ranging from 500 to 2,000 parts per billion. The EPA action level for residential soil is 100 parts per billion. We also found elevated levels of toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. What does that mean in plain English? Barbara Reynolds asked. It means there has been substantial leaking from one or more of the tanks. The contamination has spread through the soil in what we call a plume. Based on the concentration gradients, I estimate this leaking has been occurring for at least 15 to 20 years. Jennifer grabbed my hand. Is it dangerous to live there? There's no immediate acute danger. You're not going to get sick overnight. But long-term exposure to these chemicals can increase cancer risk, cause neurological problems, and affect child development. I would not let children play in direct contact with the soil. I would not grow vegetables in the contaminated areas. And if any of you have private wells, don't drink the water until it's tested. We're all on city water, Linda said. Does that matter? It reduces the risk significantly, but we should still test the water supply lines. If contamination has spread deep enough, it could affect aquifers. Robert Garrison, the lawyer, leaned forward. Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, does this require EPA notification? Absolutely. This meets the threshold for a reportable release under CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. I'm legally obligated to report this to both the Arizona DEQ and the EPA by tomorrow. Once that happens, what's the process? Linda asked. The EPA will send their own team to verify the contamination. They'll expand the testing to a larger area to determine the full extent of the problem. They'll identify potentially responsible parties, which based on that memo Miss Morrison provided, will likely include the city of Gilbert. Then they'll order remediation. How long does remediation take? Marcus Webb asked, for something this size. Years, probably 3 to 5 years minimum. It depends on how deep the contamination goes and how far it's spread. They'll likely have to excavate and remove the tanks, excavate contaminated soil, possibly install groundwater treatment systems. What happens to us during those years? I asked. That's complicated. The EPA might determine the properties are safe to occupy during remediation, or they might order temporary evacuations during active work. Property owners usually aren't forced to permanently relocate unless contamination levels are extremely high, which doesn't appear to be the case here. Barbara Reynolds was crying. I bought my house as an investment for retirement. This is going to bankrupt me. Not necessarily, Robert Garrison said. The HOA and individual homeowners can sue the City of Gilbert for property value damages, remediation costs, and health monitoring. With that memo establishing the city's knowledge and actions, we have a strong case. Lawsuits take years, David Chen said. What do we do in the meantime? Dr. Chen closed her laptop. In the meantime, I recommend the HOA hire a health and safety consultant to assess immediate risks and provide guidelines to residents. You should also consider air quality testing inside the affected homes. Petroleum vapors can infiltrate basements and lower levels. We don't have basements in Arizona, Linda said. Good. That reduces the vapor intrusion risk, but you should still test. The meeting broke up with everyone looking shell-shocked. Robert Garrison said he would file a notice of claim against the City of Gilbert by Monday, the first step in a lawsuit. Linda said she would organize another neighborhood meeting once the EPA got involved. I drove home with Jennifer in silence. What do you say when you've discovered your dream home is built on top of toxic waste? Emma was waiting up for us, despite it being past 9 p.m. She took one look at our faces and asked, "It's bad, isn't it?" I sat down next to her on the couch. The soil under our yard and some of the neighbors' yards has contamination from old fuel tanks. We're going to have to get it cleaned up, which will take a while, but we're safe as long as we're careful. Are we going to lose our house? No. We're going to fight to make sure the people responsible fix this. Emma hugged me. I heard some kids at school talking about it. They said we live in a toxic waste dump. Jennifer's expression hardened. Who said that? It doesn't matter. Is it true? I chose my honesty carefully. There is contamination, but it's not a toxic waste dump. It's old fuel that leaked from tanks that should have been removed a long time ago, and we're going to fix it. The next morning, Dr. Chen filed her reports with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA. By noon, the story had hit local news. A reporter from the Arizona Republic called me, asking for an interview. I declined, but apparently other neighbors didn't. That evening, our neighborhood was featured on the local 6 o'clock news. The headline read, "Gilbert neighborhood built on abandoned fuel tanks. Residents seek answers." My phone rang constantly. Friends, family, old colleagues, all wanting to know if we were okay. The Meadowbrook Hills Facebook group had over 300 comments, many from people who didn't even live in the neighborhood but wanted to share their opinions. On Monday, 2 EPA investigators arrived and set up a command post in the community center. They were polite but serious, treating the situation like the environmental emergency it was. They brought in a mobile testing lab and expanded the investigation area to include 8 more properties. Linda was furious. 8 more. We're up to 13 affected houses now. That's over 10% of the entire development. The lead EPA investigator, a man named Thomas Caldwell, reviewed the ground-penetrating radar data. The tank field is larger than initially thought. We've identified at least 6 underground tanks, possibly 7. The contamination plume has spread further than the initial testing indicated. How far? Robert Garrison asked. We won't know until we complete our assessment, but preliminary models suggest contamination could extend under 20 to 30 properties. The number kept growing. 20 to 30 properties meant 60 to 90 people potentially affected. Children, families, retirees who had invested their life savings. By Wednesday, the EPA had completed their verification testing. They held a public meeting attended by over 200 people, including the mayor of Gilbert and several city council members. Thomas Caldwell presented the findings with clinical detachment. We have confirmed the presence of 6 underground storage tanks, each approximately 10,000-gallon capacity, buried at depths ranging from 14 to 18 feet. Soil testing has revealed petroleum hydrocarbon contamination in concentrations ranging from 300 to 5,000 parts per billion. significantly above EPA residential action levels. The contamination plume extends approximately 200 feet in diameter from the central tank location. Someone in the audience shouted, "What is the city going to do about it?" The mayor, a polished-looking man named Richard Torres, stood up. "The city of Gilbert takes this situation very seriously. We're reviewing historical records to determine exactly what happened during the 1994 decommissioning project." "We already know what happened," Linda said, standing up and holding Helen Morrison's memo. "Your city decided it was too expensive to properly remove the tanks, so you abandoned them and built houses on top of them. This document proves it." Mayor Torres looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't in office in 1994 and I'm not familiar with that specific document. But I assure you we will conduct a thorough investigation." "Investigation?" Greg Martinson stood up. "People are already getting sick. My wife has had headaches for months. My youngest daughter has been having respiratory issues. We need action, not investigation." "Now hold on," Thomas Caldwell interjected. "Let's not jump to conclusions about health effects. The contamination is primarily in the soil. Unless you're spending hours directly exposed to contaminated soil, acute health effects are unlikely." "But what about long-term effects?" someone asked. "We've been living here for 7 years. How much exposure have we already had?" "That's something you should discuss with your personal physicians. The EPA can provide health monitoring recommendations, but we're not medical professionals." The meeting devolved into chaos. People were angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame. The mayor and city council members left quickly, surrounded by their staff. I found myself at the center of mixed reactions. Some people thanked me for discovering the problem. Others blamed me for ruining the neighborhood. One man I didn't know cornered me in the parking lot. "You just destroyed my life," he said. "I was about to sell my house and move for a new job. Now I'm stuck here with a property no one will buy." "I didn't put the tanks there," I said. "I just found them." "You should have kept your mouth shut. Now everyone's property is worthless." Jennifer pulled me away before the confrontation could escalate. "Don't engage. People are upset." Over the next 2 weeks, the EPA's investigation expanded further. They brought in drilling equipment and created a grid of monitoring wells across the neighborhood. They tested groundwater, indoor air quality, and soil at various depths. The community center became their permanent base of operations. The legal maneuvering started in earnest. Robert Garrison filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA and all affected homeowners against the city of Gilbert, the contractor who did the original tank removal, and the developer who built the neighborhood. The total damages claimed were over $50 million. The city hired their own environmental consultants, who conveniently found lower contamination levels than Dr. Chen had reported. They argued the health risks were minimal and that the properties were safe to occupy. Local news covered the story extensively. National environmental groups picked it up. We received calls from lawyers across the country wanting to get involved. Our quiet neighborhood had become ground zero for a major environmental disaster. In the middle of all this, I tried to maintain some normalcy. I went to work, helped Emma with homework, had dinner with Jennifer. But everything felt fragile, like we were living in a bubble that could pop at any moment. Then, 3 weeks after Dr. Chen's initial findings, Thomas Caldwell called an emergency meeting. His tone on the phone was grave. "We need everyone at the community center tonight at 7 p.m. We have new findings that significantly change the situation." Linda called me immediately after. "Do you know what this is about?" "No idea," but he sounded serious. That evening, the community center was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and in the doorway. The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas Caldwell stood at the front with several other EPA officials and someone I didn't recognize, a woman in a dark suit who looked like she was law enforcement. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Caldwell began. "During our expanded investigation, we made some discoveries that go beyond environmental contamination. This is Special Agent Rebecca Martinez from the FBI. The FBI. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Agent Martinez stepped forward. In the course of their environmental investigation, EPA officials discovered what appears to be a secondary underground structure adjacent to the fuel storage tanks. This structure was not documented in any city records. Yesterday, we excavated and accessed this structure. She clicked a button and an image appeared on the screen behind her. It showed a concrete bunker partially excavated from the earth. This underground bunker was approximately 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet high. It was sealed and had been hidden deliberately. Inside, we found extensive evidence of illegal activity dating back to the 1980s and early 1990s. What kind of illegal activity? Someone asked. The bunker contained documents, financial records, and physical evidence related to municipal corruption involving city officials, contractors, and organized crime connections. We're still cataloging everything, but it appears to have been used as a document repository and possibly a meeting place for illegal transactions. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. This wasn't just about abandoned fuel tanks anymore, Agent Martinez continued. Based on the evidence found, we believe certain Gilbert City officials in the 1980s and 1990s were involved in bid rigging, embezzlement, and money laundering schemes. The bunker was built secretly during the construction of the municipal maintenance yard, hidden among the legitimate infrastructure. When the decision was made to decommission the site in 1994, someone decided to leave the tanks in place deliberately to ensure the bunker remained undiscovered. Who? Linda asked. Who was involved? We're not releasing names yet as this is an active criminal investigation. But I can tell you that at least 3 former city officials are persons of interest, and we're issuing subpoenas to multiple parties. Mayor Torres was not present at this meeting, I noticed. Helen Morrison raised her hand, her voice shaking. My husband. He worked for the city during that time. Did he know about this? Agent Martinez's expression softened. Mrs. Morrison, we've reviewed your husband's personnel file. He was not involved and had no knowledge of the illegal activities. In fact, his notes and memos you provided have been helpful in establishing the timeline. The meeting continued for over an hour, with the FBI explaining that, while the environmental remediation would continue, the site was also now a federal crime scene. Certain areas would be off-limits while they completed their investigation. After the meeting ended, I stood outside in the parking lot with Jennifer trying to process everything. We bought a house on top of a secret criminal bunker, Jennifer said. This is insane. At least now we know why they left the tanks. They weren't just cutting costs. They were hiding evidence. Do you think anyone currently in city government knew about this? I don't know, but we're about to find out. Over the next month, the story exploded into a major scandal. The FBI's investigation revealed that in the 1980s, a group of Gilbert City officials had created a sophisticated corruption scheme. They rigged bids for city contracts, embezzled funds, and used the underground bunker as a secure location to store evidence of their activities and conduct meetings away from official oversight. The scheme fell apart in the early 1990s when one of the participants wanted out. Rather than risk exposure, they decided to abandon the bunker and ensure it would never be found. Leaving the fuel tanks in place and building a residential development on top was the perfect cover. 3 former city officials were arrested and charged with multiple felonies. A retired contractor who had been part of the scheme died before he could be charged. The current mayor was cleared of any knowledge or involvement, but the scandal still rocked Gilbert politics. Meanwhile, the environmental remediation began. The EPA designated Meadowbrook Hills as a Superfund site, which meant federal funds would be allocated for cleanup. The city of Gilbert, now desperate to manage the PR disaster, agreed to pay for temporary housing for any residents who wanted to relocate during the cleanup. Many families, including mine, chose to stay. The EPA assured us that with proper precautions, the properties were safe to occupy. They installed air monitoring systems in each affected home and provided regular testing. The excavation of the tanks and contaminated soil took 6 months. Massive digging equipment tore up yards and streets. Dump trucks carried away thousands of tons of contaminated earth. The old fuel tanks, corroded and leaking, were carefully extracted and disposed of as hazardous waste. The underground bunker was fully excavated and documented before being filled in. During this time, the lawsuit against the city progressed. Robert Garrison was relentless, using the FBI's findings to strengthen the case. The city's lawyers tried to argue that current taxpayers shouldn't be held responsible for crimes committed decades ago, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. 14 months after I stood in front of the HOA board with my folder of measurements and suspicions, the lawsuit was settled. The city of Gilbert agreed to pay $28 million to affected homeowners. Each property owner received compensation for property value loss, health monitoring costs, and emotional distress. The settlement also included funding for long-term groundwater monitoring and a guarantee that the city would cover any future contamination issues. My family received just over $400,000. It didn't erase the stress and fear of the past year, but it provided security. We used part of it to replace Emma's college fund, which we had depleted during the crisis, and invested the rest. The environmental cleanup was completed after 3 years of work. The EPA removed all contaminated soil, installed groundwater treatment systems, and certified the neighborhood as safe. New soil, grass, and landscaping were installed at federal expense. Meadowbrook Hills looked better than it ever had, though the history would always be there. Linda Carmichael, who had been HOA president through the entire ordeal, stepped down afterward. She told me privately that the stress had taken years off her life, but she was glad we had fought for justice. "You know," she said at her farewell HOA meeting, "when you first stood up here with your obsessive measurements and wild theories, I thought you were crazy. I almost dismissed you entirely. I'm glad I didn't." "I'm glad you listened," I said. The thing is, most people would have ignored the signs. They would have told themselves it was nothing, that they were being paranoid. But you trusted your observations and had the courage to speak up even when you knew people would think you were obsessed. "I was obsessed," I admitted. "I lost sleep for 2 years over this. Sometimes obsession is what's needed. Sometimes the crazy person turns out to be the only sane one." Life gradually returned to normal, or at least a new normal. Emma grew out of the embarrassment of living in the toxic neighborhood and even wrote her 8th grade English essay about the experience. Jennifer got a promotion at her job, and we started planning a long-delayed vacation. I still measured things, because that was my nature. But I tried to channel the obsession into healthier outlets, like helping Emma with her science fair projects instead of monitoring soil settlement patterns. The criminal trials of the former city officials dragged on for 2 more years. 2 were convicted and sentenced to federal prison. The third took a plea deal and cooperated with prosecutors, revealing even more details about the corruption scheme. Some former Gilbert residents came forward with stories about how the corruption had affected them, lost contracts and blocked opportunities because they wouldn't play along with the scheme. The scandal led to major reforms in how Gilbert managed city contracts and finances. As for my yard, the excavation and remediation had left it completely transformed. Where the underground tanks had once sat, there was now clean soil, new grass, and a garden Jennifer had planted. We put in a playset for Emma, even though she was probably getting too old for it. One evening, 5 years after I first noticed the ground settling, I stood in that backyard watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky orange and purple. Emma was doing homework inside. Jennifer was making dinner. It was ordinary and peaceful. Greg Martinson walked over from his yard carrying 2 beers. "Thought you might want one." Thanks. I took the bottle. How's your family doing? Good. Sarah's headaches went away after the cleanup. The doctors said it might have been related to the contamination or it might have been stress. Either way, she's better now. That's good. You ever regret bringing all this up? If you had just ignored it, none of us would have gone through the past 5 years of hell. I thought about that. We also would have kept living on top of contamination. Our kids would have kept playing in toxic soil, and that bunker full of evidence of crimes would still be hidden. So no, I don't regret it. Fair enough. But man, you really know how to make life interesting. We stood there drinking beer, two neighbors who had been through something extraordinary together. The underground tanks were gone. The contamination was cleaned up. The criminals were in prison. The lawsuit was settled. And my obsession with measuring soil settlement had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. Later that night, after Emma was asleep and Jennifer had gone to bed, I pulled out the folder I had brought to that first HOA meeting. 5 years of documentation, measurements, photographs, theories. I had kept everything, unable to throw it away even after it had all been resolved. Jennifer found me looking through it. Are you okay? Yeah, just thinking about how this all started. I measured a patch of ground because something felt wrong, and it ended up uncovering decades of corruption and environmental crime. You know what I think? Jennifer sat down next to me. I think you saved this neighborhood. If those tanks had kept leaking for another 10 years, the contamination would have been so much worse. If that bunker had never been found, those crimes would have gone unpunished forever. You did something important. I just measured some dirt. You trusted yourself when everyone else thought you were crazy. That takes courage. She was right, though I had never thought of it that way. I had just been obsessive, unable to let something go even when it would have been easier to ignore it. The next morning, I finally filed away the folder, placing it in the back of a cabinet. The story was over. The crisis was resolved. Life could continue, but I kept my surveying equipment just in case. Because you never know when you might notice something wrong, when a small observation might lead to uncovering something big. And I had learned that sometimes the obsessive person who can't let things go is exactly what's needed. At the next HOA meeting, held in the same community center where so many dramatic revelations had occurred, new business was discussed. Someone wanted to paint their house a slightly different shade of beige. Someone else had a complaint about a neighbor's decorative rocks. Linda's replacement as president, a quiet engineer named Robert Kim, handled everything with efficient calm. It was boring, routine, normal. And it was perfect. When the meeting ended, I walked home through streets I knew by heart, past houses filled with families who had been through crisis together and come out the other side. Meadowbrook Hills would always be known as the neighborhood with the underground tanks, the hidden bunker, the Superfund site. But it was also the neighborhood that fought back, that demanded accountability, that refused to be victimized. And it all started because I confessed my HOA obsession to the board. They excavated my yard, and we found the truth below.